This is Kurt Doolittle for the Propertarian Institute. Welcome to part 3 of the nervous system. Our topic is vision and the neocortex. Hopefully in part 2 we succeeded in developing an understanding of the common cortical algorithm, meaning scales of networks of competition for successful prediction, and that the cortex does about the same thing everywhere, and that each region's responsibilities are determined by what they're connected to, and then all of these regions are connected to one another. Now that we understand our powers of prediction using the emphasis on touch, let's look at errors in prediction using our most developed and sensitive of the senses, vision. The light that hits our eyes is the same that hits the sand on the beach, the side of your house, the surface of a leaf, and it's just a very high frequency vibration striking your retina. But unlike sand, home, or leaf, we've got to disambiguate it in order to act by making use of it. Over the past 2.5 centuries, we've seen photography demonstrate that what the human eye sees and what the camera sees are pretty nearly identical, except for our rather exceptional ability to compensate for differences in luminosity. While we have color vision, most of the cells in our eyes sense luminosity, or black and white, or light and dark, and we have quite a few neurons and groups of neurons that compensate for those differences in light. The camera doesn't have this feature, although we can use current digital technology to mimic our vision's abilities today, as we see in this image. That said, the camera doesn't need to develop a three-dimensional world, so to speak, so that it can act within it. If we were as sort of dumb as the camera, so to speak, we could only see darkness, or maybe white noise, or maybe white noise including color. We wouldn't be able to disambiguate that noise into objects, spaces, and scenes. Somehow, we have to disambiguate that noise into scenes, objects within those scenes, and spaces between those objects, and hopefully recognize what objects and spaces can be acted upon within the scene. The term we use in vision for importance is salience. We have to disambiguate the important and salient from noise or background. In this sense, we don't really see an illusion of the world. Instead, we see what the camera sees, but by see, we mean we can only focus our attention and gather more information about those elements of the world that we're both able to disambiguate and to determine our salience. So we filter out noise or clutter by not disambiguating it from the background and making it available to our attention, but instead perceiving scene elements more like variations in texture than disambiguated objects. There's no use in disambiguating every leaf on every tree until we need to act upon the leaf, the branch, or the tree, rather than simply limit ourselves to a background consisting of a wall of trees. And our eyes and cortex do the work of disambiguating, using prediction, a scene into background objects and spaces. And it's accomplished by incremental means of edges, shapes, textures, contrast, color, and time. What we've learned over the past decades is that we don't see scenes and objects and then determine spaces, but that we determine scenes, backgrounds, objects, and the entities we can act within them, along with their textures, volume, and spaces, because we aren't like the camera just looking at pictures, so to speak. We're discovering opportunities to act within them. So let's look at some of the examples of each of those dimensions I just mentioned and see what we can learn from failures to disambiguate meaning and noise. Before we do that, I want to review terms. I'm trying to sort of beat the dead horse of geometry over and over again for reasons I think are starting to become clear. In this case, let's review our hierarchy for a moment. A point, a pixel, or a cone in the eye, an edge or a vertex, a fragment, a texture or surface or face, a feature, an object, meaning a volume that occupies space, a model, say a category like cats, an entity, like an extential reference, like a cat that we know, a path through space, spaces themselves, the background, and the scene. So here we go. Optical illusions. This is a video of white noise. You'll either disambiguate it into space like a window, a surface like a texture, or retain emphasis on the background and see just a rectangle of noise depending upon whatever habitual bias you've developed, which is to stay in the moment, to observe motion, or to enter suspension of disbelief or enter the imaginary world. In this image, we see depth of field. There are zebras in stereoscope. It illustrates disambiguating by depth of field. Now, it takes some concentration, but most of us can alter our depth of field, meaning we can cross our eyes, and disambiguate the zebras from the noise of the background. So in this example, we've shown that it's quite difficult, but we can use depth of field to disambiguate noise into objects. Now, this image of zebras is easier to disambiguate, partly because of their manes. If it was a video rather than a still image, it would be even harder still. Zebra manes, stripes, and eyes are pretty hard to disambiguate because the stripes look like edges and they overload our edge-finding ability. They confuse us. They're a texture rather than an edge, but they're a texture we perceive as an edge. So, using edges to confuse is an exceptional tactic for overloading our first layer of disambiguation. In this image, we see another difficult disambiguation, this time using texture. Instead of overloading with edges, because we lack edges in this image, we're overloaded by texture. We have to predict the edges by the pattern of the texture, in this case, splotches and dots. Some of us will succeed rather quickly in predicting the Dalmatian from the texture, and some of us will take longer, and some of us will frankly just give up. And here we add a little contrast to show those edges that we predicted, for those of us who could anyway. It's funny, I think the first time I saw this image I was in 6th grade, and I got very frustrated that I couldn't find the Dalmatian. I just felt that I was somehow horribly incompetent. In this image, we learn a little more about using textures to predict edges, and with those edges, predict the feature inside. So is this example any easier? So to explain, our receptors, neurons, fibers look for the relations between nearby pixels, sensors, points, and trying to find a higher level pattern using them that we can disambiguate into features, scenes, spaces, etc. And we do that using edge, texture, luminosity, and color. Now, even with ambiguous edges, we can still disambiguate a common model in motion because the relative consistency of related pixels over time. I mean, there's enough pixels that are saying in some sort of constant relation to each other that even in motion we can identify the center mass and with it predict what object it is we're looking at. Although in a little bit we'll show the limits of that ability because our ability to disambiguate over time really does have a limit to it. This is the most common optical illusion. It shows how we disambiguate the feature at one end of the bars and the feature at the other end of the bars, and then the texture in between. And we predict all three of these into an object, but one that isn't internally coherent. Again, we see correctly disambiguating the elephant from the background using major edges like the upper outline, the head, the trunk, and the legs as separate features. And we probably sense something is incoherent or incommensurable, and we put our focus on the legs, and we see that indeed they are. So I use this example to show you how we can disambiguate the features of the body, head, and feet and predict a coherent model despite internal incoherence of the features of that model. What we see here is perhaps a tendency to error, but it's actually graceful failure. In other words, we can still disambiguate something from its features even if parts remain ambiguous. One of the best illustrations of our predictability is this popular example from the early days of the internet, where as long as the first and last letters are in position, the rest really don't need to be, any more than the elephants or the bars need to be, in order for us to disambiguate the word from other words and to understand them. That's because we actually recognize the word in its entirety. In other words, as we practice reading, we learn to look at a word as a collection, and as long as the edges, the first and last letter, are about correct, we can identify those words. This is a problem I have. I rarely recognize mixed up letters. I won't even see them. Now, we have this same thing in typography, because if you look at the tops of the letters alone, you can generally identify them, although if you look at the bottoms of letters, you can't. This is one of the values of the method we use in our typography, is that people understand this, and so they work at making sure that the top half of letters, the edges, are easily disambiguated. So hopefully we're succeeding in helping you grasp how pixel-to-pixel relations over time accumulate into edge or texture, and then into sufficient fragments, and then into objects, meaning volumes, then into entities, meaning individual cases, and by expanding increases the scope of our vision. In other words, we may start with a very narrow thing like the elephant's trunk and add pieces together until we can use the various depths of our vision to produce an object that we can refer to. And that while these predictions can err in one way or another, we find that their ability to succeed in predicting something actionable despite errors or missing information is an advantage of us. And we don't think of this imprecision as an advantage, but it really is. We can always focus our attention further and get more information if we want, but at the same time we can rapidly disambiguate the world by prediction from sparse information. This is sort of how a fly's eye works, right? I mean, they're very primitive. However, they are exceptional at detecting motion, which is why they're so hard to catch. Now, in this image, we'll note that the squares labeled A and B are actually the same color, but in order to compensate for differences in light and dark, we've evolved the ability to compensate in ways that the camera doesn't, at least without digital manipulation. If you place the two squares next to each other, and there are examples you can find online of this, the similarity will be rather obvious. The closer you get them, the more obvious it becomes. So if you start with two things touching and then move them apart from each other a little bit and then closer and closer together, you'll see how your eyes and brain compensate for those differences in color rather rapidly. The same applies, though, for color. All of the balls in this picture are the same color, brown. Your vision predicts the general color of the balls from the fragmentary information available. The bars are more consistent than the light and dark of the balls, which, being brown, are a muddy combination of many colors, and therefore were easily influenced. Now, personally, I didn't believe it until I saw this image with masks that limited us to the background color. Even now that I understand it, I still can't visualize it without the masks. Now we come to the problem of time between exposures, so to speak. In other words, our ability to judge differences over time. It's not very long. The next few images are separated by darkness. See if you can identify what's changing between the two images. I couldn't do it. So, did you see it? Okay, look at the bottom of the wing of the plane just to the right of the stairs. Now do you see it? The engine was not there, then not. But you can't notice the change because of the time delay. This is a fairly well-known case with examples dating back to the 90s, 70s, 60s, and some people argue the 50s. The AI software in this recent photo classification exercise was incorrectly identifying this husky as a wolf. When they looked into what parts of the image the software was using to make the decision, it turned out to be the snow. The sample data had included wolves, most of which were taking pictures of in snow, so it sorted the picture by the background rather than the foreground. I included this because it's an example of how people, as well as AIs, can be confused by context from background. When I was working in artificial intelligence back in the days when we found it wasn't going anywhere for quite a while, the example that was running around was tanks. So feed a bunch of information about tanks into an image recognition system for a missile and it can identify them. But we found that something was wrong. It turned out that because all the pictures of the tanks were taken in daylight, that all we were doing was producing a daylight detector. So we hadn't actually identified tanks. This seems to have been repeated. There's some internet mythology about it. Although the initial discourse was theoretical, it actually turned out to be real. Next, we're going to deal with salience. This image shows eye tracking as the viewer sequentially focuses his 5 degrees of detail vision on features of the image. Now, I chose this partly for humor. This image shows how men and women evaluate the female body differently. The shoes always make me laugh, as does the reflection in the mirror. And here's another one. This image shows how men and women evaluate each other's bodies differently. This is about what you'd expect, triangular men and breast, hip, waist ratio in women, with both using our most accurate measure of genetic health and condition in life, our facial construction and expression, as the highest priority. So salience varies. For example, on average, little girls are a lot more afraid of spiders and snakes than little boys, and movement is more important than stasis, and predators and prey more important than background, and humans are most important of all. So far, we've covered the dimensions of prediction. Now let's look at the underlying biology and tie it back to our model using geometry. Vision alone uses half of our nerves and almost as much of our processing power. Since everything rolls forward in the cortex, so to speak, vision, at the rear of the brain, is eventually associated with everything. There are about 30 regions in the brain that participate somehow in vision. We're not going to cover all of them. I don't know how, and so we'll limit ourselves to understanding how vision enters and makes use of the common cortical algorithm. So in this image of the primary visual pathways, light enters the eye, strikes the photoreceptors on the retina, meaning pixels or points. The retina does do some processing and then transmits the information to the thalamus, which regulates what passes through to the visual cortex at the back of the brain. It appears that when the thalamus is regulating information, it's controlling the ratio between observation and visualization, or external and internal vision. This allows us to pay greater attention to what we observe or greater attention to what we visualize, imagine, or think. Again, I'm going to reiterate that some people have no inner visualization ability and others near perfect, and others have no inner voice, in other words, they don't talk to themselves, and some of us near perfect. In rough numbers, that I put a little trust in, there are about 10% with no inner vision and 20% with no inner voice. Something those of us with both kind of find terrifying. The eye is a complex organ. The muscles point the eye in position or direction. The lens controls depth of field, and the retina takes in light and returns information. So our starting dimensions are position of the eye, or direction, depth of field, and sensitivity to light. That brings us to the retina. The eye contains layers of cells, and strangely, they're sort of layered backwards from what we'd assume, with the transport nerves on top, the nerve cells that are transparent, and next, and the photoreceptor cells at the very back of the eye against the pigmentation layer. There are sort of two categories of photoreceptors in the retina, cones and rods. There are about 100 million of these rods and cones in the retina. Rods are sensitive to dim light but insensitive to color because on a moonlit night the light is too dim to see color. Cones, on the other hand, operate in bright light and discriminate between colors. So humans have 3 different cone cell types, one most sensitive to red, one to green, and one to blue. The rods outnumber the cones 10 to 1, except in the center of your view near the macula where the cones predominate. This is why you have to look to the side of a dim star to see it. After light is detected by the cones, neurotransmitters carry the signal to the next layer of the retina. Here, nerve cells, called opponent cells, compare the activity of the red versus the green cones. Then this combined yellow signal is compared with the blue cone by a second set of opponent cells. The result of these color differences is then sent to the brain. At the present time, there's a lot of controversy over color processing after the retina. I can't give an opinion on it, I just don't know enough to do so. Now, 7% of men and 0.5% of women see red and green differently from the rest of the population. They are red-green colorblind. This recipe for the red and green cones resides in genes on the X chromosome. Women have 2 of those, while men have only 1. The DNA sequences for the red and green receptors differ by only about 2%, evidence that they diverged relatively recently. Peripheral vision is sensitive to scenes, movement, and low light, while central vision is concerned with spaces, objects, textures, and colors. This is basically a question of resolution. Light and dark is a very low resolution, movement is a low resolution, scene composition is low resolution, while central vision, spaces, object, textures, and colors, needs to be higher resolution because it needs more information in order to disambiguate it. My understanding is that in addition to transporting information, the retinal ganglion cells detect micro motion, just as the prefrontal cortex's eye field function is to track object motion. The retinal bipolar cells are the only neurons that connect the outer retina to the inner. They implement an extra layer of processing that's just not found in other sensory organs. There are at least 3 distinct types of bipolar cells that systematically transform the photoreceptor input and generate specific channels that encode properties such as on or off, or what in the literature is called polarity. Contrast, continuous or transient, in other words, remains constant over time or is temporary. The light, dark, and color composition. So as a result, bipolar cell output signals represent elementary building blocks or fragments that the inner retina disambiguates into features. So in our geometric language, we see the eyes performing at least the following dimensions. Our starting dimensions were position of the eye, depth of field, and sensitivity to light. And further, we can find the dimensions of sensitivity to light as change, on, off, sufficient, insufficient, or polarity, proximity between cells, constant relations, even over whether static or over time, light and dark, color, and motion. The first-order neurons terminate in the second-order neurons, which reach the optic nerve, and the third-order neurons terminate in the primary visual cortex. So information is organized, consolidated, and relayed to the visual cortex. So much like cortical columns process information between, in, and out of layers, so does the retina. Our primary concern here is that even in the eye, there are cells performing calculation and pre-processing information and a division of labor, and that this division of labor consists of taking fragmentary information and disambiguating it, and that there are both goods and bads that result, goods and bads that can only be resolved by our use of attention to produce direct observation in a limited field of vision with more dense and more color-sensitive neurons using continuous recursive sampling over time. Now, this is about the depth of my knowledge of the eye and optic nerve. That said, of the senses and of the brain in general, this is one of the best understood areas of the nervous system. That, like speech recognition, we have been most successful in implementing using artificial intelligence. And you'll easily find videos and papers by the top people in each of the fields in anatomy, medicine, cognitive science, and computer science fields. Continuing with the visual pathway, we move through the thalamus. That section of the thalamus is called the lateral geniculate nuclei, where the left and right fields of vision in each eye are associated and merged. Then through the optic radiations, meaning nerves, and into the primary visual cortex in the occipital lobes at the rear of the brain. Unlike other cortical columns, columns in the visual cortex are specialized to identify angular relations between pixels, and from fields in both eyes, and organized into dense cortical modules. The information accumulates into ever larger receptive fields, meaning that features are combined into objects, large objects crossing our field of attention, into spaces across our field of vision, and finally into scenes, and lastly into simulations, whether they're in our field of vision or not. Note that color is separately processed, so like our 3D modeling analogy, faces, objects, and surfaces are painted separately. And that as we construct objects, we seek to unify and make commensurable by detection of motion, as we saw with our cat and its stripes, so that we can attribute greater salience to whatever's in motion. In this sense, you can think of the visual cortex as reflecting the organization of the eye, with ever greater fields of vision radiating outward in a sort of target shape, trying to construct something coherent out of pixels, fragments, features, objects, models, entities, and scenes. Each iteration passing its puzzle pieces forward to the next and competing for attention by successful prediction of coherence over time. Our brains divide the work along the dorsal and ventral pathways. One of the things they focus on is salience. Salience is, again, the importance of imagery. So it's more of an issue of filtering. Once we can identify objects, anything that isn't identifiable is left as background. Let's compare the dorsal and ventral pathways. The objects that we successfully disambiguate into candidates for action are processed laterally on the ventral or what pathway. The spatial locations we cannot disambiguate into objects remain in the scene and are processed vertically on the dorsal or where pathway so that we can navigate through space. So again, we see a division of labor between environment, spaces, and objects of interest. I tend to think in terms of roots, where, and prey, what, because I tend to reduce things to their original evolutionary demand. What I'd like to get across to you is that spatial information is something like peripheral vision that we more feel than see. In other words, peripheral, boundary, background, scene, and spatial information is always at a lower cognitive resolution than objects, and objects in the periphery of our attention at lower cognitive resolution than whatever we focus our attention upon. So we rely more on prediction the farther away from the narrow field of our attention, and even lower when we are splitting our attention between what we're doing and what we're imagining, and even lower when we are doing nothing and almost entirely imagining. So it's those three axes I'd like you to internalize. The first is path, spaces, periphery, and boundary. The second is objects we're manipulating, objects of our attention, objects competing for our attention. And three, the distribution of our attention from external observation to internal imagination. And we feed forward this information from neurons to columns to collections of columns to regions to networks, and progressively forward in ever greater associations until we've constructed a model of the world that enables us to act. And so let's return to our example, which is pretty much what our brains do to compose an entity that we can act in response to. I like this theme so much, that's why I keep bringing it up, as it is such a good visualization of how it is that we produce imagery. So coherent patterns, whether in focus, border of our attention, periphery, or out of range of our attention, like the legs of the elephant or the engine on the plane, resolve or they fail to resolve and are ignored as error. In the engine on the plane example, the difference between states is interpreted by your brain as irrelevant, error, since it's only background and didn't survive in short-term memory. So our world is constructed from predictions that are determined by their actionability, our attention, and the distribution of our attention between observation and imagination. Now, my goal has been to provide you with a basic understanding of how information moves through the visual system of the brain and the dimensions of causality at the eye and at the visual cortex, and how attention using the thalamus affects resolution. And lastly, how whether in the eye or the visual cortex, the common cortical algorithm is the same, disambiguation of stimuli using recursion into relations between our senses, body, objects, and environment. If I've been successful, you'll be able to articulate experiences people describe in operational terms using those dimensions of causality we've covered. So again, in geometry, they're point or pixel or cone in the eye, edge or vertex, fragment, texture. Fragment would be like a little bit of the 4 or a little bit of the 3 or the top of the letter T. Texture or surface or face. Texture is pretty obvious by now. Feature would be a sub-object that you could call out. An object, meaning a value that occupies space. A model, say all cats. An entity, saying a cat that we know. A path, space, background, and scene. Background tending to be limits. I tend to think of the background as walls. In the eye, it's change for on, off, sufficient or insufficient, or polarity, as they use in the industry. Proximity between cells, constant relations. The light and the dark, the color, the motion, the distance, the focal length, the position and direction. The thalamus, which contains attention or importance or salience, distribution of attention to observation or imagination. The occipital lobe, in our visual cortex, which deals with edges, fragments, features, and then divides into background, spaces, paths, or locations, the where division, or the what division of objects, models, entities, and position. And then lastly, we integrate that into what's actionable or manipulable. Our fields of vision, prediction, and simulation include our narrow field of vision, our eye's peripheral field of vision, our predicted scene assembled from that vision, and our predicted simulation assembled from those scenes, much of which remains nothing more than a sense, an intuition. Time, by ever-increasing field of vision over continuously recursive resupply of information, by movements of the body, head, eye, and subject matter, creating a continuously modified simulation of the world where we discover continuously changing opportunities to act, look, manipulate, and move. And we have prediction error dimensions. They are depth of field, inability to disambiguate edges, as in zebras, inability to disambiguate edges from textures, dogs, inability to disambiguate features of objects, the bars and the elements, inability to disambiguate features, thereby overlooking details, the scrambled words, inability to disambiguate shades because of compensation for light and dark, the chessboard, inability to correctly disambiguate colors, the balls, inability to disambiguate features over time, the engine, inability to disambiguate context because of background, wolf or husky, and a bias in disambiguation given our difference in valuation or salience. We probably have a good handle by now on how we disambiguate objects, the what. Next, we'll take a look at the dorsal pathway, the where, and the other major discovery of the past few years, position, path, and location. I hope you enjoyed this. This is Kurt Doolittle for the Propertarian Institute.